In this video, I'd like to talk about absolute maxima and minima points, specifically regarding different function types. So, an absolute maxima is the highest overall point on a graph. So let me write that down. So we have an absolute maxima, and that, like I mentioned, is going to be the highest overall point on the graph. Whereas if we're talking about an absolute minima, you might be able to guess that that will be the lowest overall point on the graph. So knowing the two definitions, we can take a closer look at these example problems. And in this one, we need to mark the absolute maximum. So we're looking for the highest point on this curve here. Or more specifically, we're looking for the point that has the highest y value. And that looks to be this point right here, since notice it has a y value of 6, whereas this point, which you might think is a candidate, has a y value of 5. So this is our absolute maximum, and this point right down here, this is our absolute minimum. And we could even mark the relative maxima and minima. For instance, this right here, this is a valley, and the lowest point in a valley we would call the relative minima. And the highest point, or a peak compared to its nearby points, this is what we would call a relative maxima. But of course, in these problems, we're not concerned with the relative points, we're concerned with the absolute points. So this point right here is the highest out of all points on the blue curve. So with that in mind, knowing these definitions, let's look at some more example problems. And this one is looking for the absolute minimum of the graph. So we're looking for the point on this blue curve with the lowest possible y value, or the most negative. And that looks to be this y value right there. It is lower than the y value of any point on the graph. And for this one, the absolute maximum, it looks to be in two different points. So those would tie for the absolute maximum. But this one is concerned with the absolute minimum, and so that's going to be right there. And so let's do two more problems. And once you get the hang of these, they are fairly quick. So this one, we're again looking for that minimum point. So you can imagine tracing along your curve. These right here, these are all relative minimum points, since they are the lowest when looking at points around them, but none of them are the absolute. The absolute point is right here, since this has a y value less than any of them. So the absolute minimum can be found at your lowest point on the graph. And we'll look at one final question. And this one is asking us for that absolute maximum point, so the highest point on the graph. So you can imagine tracing along. This would be a relative maxima. This is a relative minimum. Actually, this is the absolute minimum. Going up, this is another peak, so another relative maximum. Going back down, we have another relative minimum. And going all the way up, it looks to be this point right here, since it has a y value of 6, which is higher than the y value of any point on the balloon curve. This right here would be our absolute maximum. It is higher than every other point.